Questions 20 to 24 deal with 4 poems about World War I, and the first of these, question 20, asks us to pick out a word in the first poem which has a moral value not usually associated with it outside of the poem. Before we go any further, it is worth pointing out that the footnote given here contains historically incorrect information. It says that German soldiers were unpaid. They were paid, but they were volunteer soldiers, as opposed to British soldiers who, until 2016, were volunteers and professionals. However, that factually incorrect information should not affect our ability to answer this question. Everything we need to answer it is in the text of the poem itself. Because the question is asking us about moral value, this will necessarily involve an evaluative judgment. So something is judged morally good or morally bad. And more specifically, we need to see whether something that is usually used negatively is used positively here, or vice versa. So let's take a look. Heaven was falling. The word heaven is used here neutrally. The negativity is then added by heaven was falling. So A is out. Suspended. Their shoulders held the sky suspended. This is a neutral / positive usage. We can't say that it is being given any specific moral value that it doesn't usually have. Abandoned, clearly negative, generally, and negative here, what God abandoned. So we are not imbuing here abandoned with a positive meaning that it doesn't usually carry. Now, the word mercenary, however, is used derogatively, as the footnote will tell you. But here, Houseman is turning it on its head, if you will, and saying, actually, these mercenaries, these people you call mercenaries, who were soldiers, who were volunteers, and they were paid, but they paid a very high price for those wages, which apparently were extremely low. So it says, followed their mercenary calling and took their wages. Yes, they were mercenaries, but they had a calling. Yes, they took their wages and are dead, but they are now dead. They have paid the ultimate price for those wages. In the second stanza, he goes on to say, what God abandoned, they defended. And then they saved the sum of things. They saved everything for Britain. Yes, they did it for pay, but they did it at a time when nobody else was willing to come to our rescue, including God, according to this poem. Therefore, B is your correct answer. Question 21 is about the poem They, which is a dialogue between the bishop character and the so-called boys, i.e. the young soldiers who had served in the war. And we are asked to determine which of the bishop's comments, which of the things that the bishop says to the quote-unquote boys would these soldiers find the most offensively glib, i.e. the most depressing. So let's take a look. We can see A, B, and C are all things that the bishop says to praise the quote-unquote boys. The praise that he gives may be objectionable and vacuous, it may be offensive to them, but it at least attempts to appeal to their sense of pride. D, however, when the bishop says the ways of God are strange, this is akin to shrugging his shoulders. What directly precedes it is the soldiers describing the incredible sacrifices that they have made. One has gone blind, the other lost both his legs, and the bishop effectively just shrugs his shoulders and says, well, who knows why this happened? The ways of God are strange. So it is a dismissive comment. These soldiers have sacrificed everything for the war effort, and this is the best answer, the best encouragement the bishop can give them, which is dismissive and indeed offensively glib. So D is your correct answer. Question 22 deals with the poem Glory of Women, which is an accusation of women by a World War I soldier. The soldier is saying that women are superficial, they enjoy the idea of glory and sacrifice that war brings, but they keep a safe distance from the gory details. And the question is asking us which of the things the soldier character says here most emphatically suggests blame, most emphatically blames the women for their superficiality. And I'm going to go through the options in order of how emphatically they suggest blame, starting with the least blameful and building up to the most blameful. Let's take a look. You love us when we're heroes. That in itself is not particularly suggesting blame. Perhaps you can love someone when they are a hero and fully embrace the gory details of their sacrifice. So A is out. D, you crown our distant ardors. Now, this is already more blameworthy because the ardors are distant, so that there is an implicit suggestion that you crown our sacrifice and our effort, but they are distant sacrifices and efforts. You don't want to come anywhere near the actual nature of what we do. B, you worship decorations. Now, everybody would agree that decorations are not a very worthwhile thing to worship. So it does make women look very superficial and silly. But C, you make us shells, is the one that is expressing blame most strongly, because it is saying you are denying the very reality of our being. We are humans, and you make us just these shells on which you can hang decorations and talk about the glory of their sacrifice. So C is your correct answer. Question 23 now asks us to zoom out and look at all the poems together and determine which of these is the least angry poem. Now, 3 of these poems we have already looked at closely because of the preceding questions. So we know that poem 4, Glory of Women, is quite angry with the stance that the women allegedly take towards the fighting in World War I. We know that poem 2, They, is very angry with the bishop and more broadly the attitude of the church. It is to be reasoned. And poem 3, we can see that it begins with, it is a goddamn lie. Straight away, this poem strikes a very angry tone and then continues with a sarcastic understatement saying there are some elements of worth that these so-called mercenaries exhibited by sacrificing their lives. Poem 1, however, that is the poem we began our analysis of this unit with, strikes more of a wistful tone. It is sad rather than angry. It's adopting a philosophical, matter-of-fact tone, saying, they followed their calling, they took their wages, and they are dead. So it's quite flat, almost. It is sad, it is wistful, it is not particularly angry, or at least that anger is not allowed to boil to the surface. Question 24 asks us, which of the 4 poems suggests that peaceful civilization itself is at least partly the cause of the horror of war? Now, in order to pick the right poem, we at first discard the poems that do not directly deal with the horror of war. And if we look at poems 1 and 3, both of these poems make an argument about mercenaries, so they are not directly engaging with the topic of the horror of war. Their focus is different. However, poems 2 and 4 do engage quite directly in some detail with the horror of war. So let's take a look and see which of these blames peaceful civilization for the war and its horrors. Now, in poem 4, we can see that women, in a way, represent the peaceful civilization that the question is talking about. If we look at line 6, it says, "You listen with delight, by tales of dirt and danger fondly thrilled." So the women take a sort of perverse pleasure in hearing these stories without being implicated personally in any of the risks and dangers that these situations imply. Lines 9 and 10, it then goes on to say, you can't believe that British troops retire, i.e., you can't believe that they retreat. So you are indignant that your British troops would be so cowardly as to retreat on the battlefield. But it goes on to say, but you have no idea what it is actually like for hell's last horror to break you and for you to run trampling on your comrades' corpses. So this poem most closely suggests that this peaceful civilization, which rings false in this poem, which is full of artifice, full of misunderstanding of the real situation, is partly the cause of the horror of war. Women like to glorify the men who fight, but they don't understand, because they are not themselves involved. They do not understand the extent of the horrors that men go through in order to bring those medals home. Poem 2, on the other hand, is less of a confrontation between the soldier and this quote-unquote peaceful civilization, and more of a confrontation between the soldier and the church, as we saw earlier. Question 25 features a graph and two definitions, one of trickle-down economics and the other of socialism. So we have to work with the definitions as they are here presented. We cannot be working with our own external definition of socialism or trickle-down economics. That is important. In spite of having several stimuli, this is actually a very simple question, particularly if we ignore the graph format and just think of the question as, would a proponent of trickle-down economics say that socialism is beneficial or advantageous to self or disadvantageous? And would they say that it is advantageous to others or disadvantageous to others? That is all the question is essentially asking. Now, we can see in the definition of trickle-down economics that the proponent of trickle-down economics would believe that what is advantageous to the wealthy is also advantageous to the poor and to the middle classes. We see from the definition of socialism that socialism demands the equal distribution of wealth, from which we can deduce that it would be disadvantageous to the wealthy. So if you are a wealthy person, then assuming that wealth is advantageous to you, socialism would be disadvantageous to you because it would take wealth away from you. So by establishing that a proponent of trickle-down economics would say that socialism is disadvantageous to him or herself, we therefore select quadrants 1 and 3. We have narrowed down our choices because it would be in the half of the graph that deals with things that are disadvantageous to self. The next step in our reasoning is therefore to determine whether it would be judged advantageous to others or disadvantageous to others. And here again, we have to look at the definition of trickle-down economics that is given to us, and we can see that what is disadvantageous to the wealthy, i.e. to the self in this case, is also disadvantageous to the poor and the middle classes. So in other words, it cannot be advantageous to anyone if it is disadvantageous to the wealthy. That's convenient, isn't it? So therefore, the only possible quadrant it can be in is quadrant 3, because a proponent of trickle-down economics would maintain that because socialism takes money away from the wealthy, it is by default bad for everybody else as well, because there is no wealth trickling down. Wealth is distributed instead of trickling down, and that is something that a trickle-down economics proponent would not support. Questions 26 and 27 have a somewhat confusing layout if you're not familiar with this format of questions in the GAMSAT, essentially you need to imagine that you are in a debate and that the statement you are arguing for or against is nature is much more important than nurture. You are then given, as questions 26 and 27, two statements, and you need to decide whether each of these would be used to argue for or against the main debate statement, i.e. the statement of nature is much more important than nurture. And the confusing bit about the layout, at least as I found it, is that the options for each of these questions are the same and they are only given once. Question 26, by saying that environment is important in somebody's development, is clearly an argument that could only be used against the main debate statement. If the statement is that nature is very important and you are saying, well, actually, environment is a crucial determinant, then of course you are arguing against the motion. So therefore, question 26 is part of the debate against. The correct answer there is B. Question 27 talks about twins, and specifically at twins that are raised in different environments. Why is this important? Twins represent nature, and if the environments are different, if the twins are separated, then any similarity between them, whether in their character, their preferences, and so on, will be attributable to nature. It will not be attributable to nurture because the twins were not nurtured together. Therefore, D is out because this is definitely very relevant to the debate of nature versus nurture. C is out because there is no way that this proposition could be used to argue against the topic. That would be self-defeating. And B is out for the same reason. So it can only be used to argue for the main debate motion that nature is stronger than nurture. And therefore, A is your correct answer here. Questions 28 to 33 are about a few longish passages, and we are told that they are all concerned with understanding human history. Always read that introduction in the beginning because it tells you what you're dealing with. It really helps you to focus. So, which passage is most concerned with communication? That is what question 28 asks us. We can see in passage 1 that it is concerned with the causes of historical events. Passage 3 is more about the battles of civilizations and who can properly be called civilized. Whereas passage 4 simply is concerned with progress. Option B, or passage 2, is the correct answer here because it talks about communication, even though it calls communication expression. It says the poet's verse expresses his age, and moreover, it talks about what is important about telling somebody of what it is like to live in a certain age as being not events, names, or facts, but emotion, action, and life. So it is saying that the best way to communicate what it is like to live in a given age is through poetry, and therefore it is making a point about communication. Question 29 asks us to decide which of the passages is the most passionate. While passage 1 and passage 4 express no particular passion of any kind, they are rather methodical in their explanations. I struggled between passages 2 and 3. Passage 2 is a red herring of sorts because it talks about something that we tend to associate with passion, that is poetry, especially the last two lines. Not events and names, but emotion, but action, but life. That repetition, that anaphora of but, really makes us think this is a passionate passage. However, more than one passage can be passionate without all of them being the right answer, because of course, once again, in the characteristic GAMSAT fashion, the question is phrased with most. It is the superlative, the most passionate passage that we need to locate. And if we look at passage 3, even though it is somewhat verbose, it is also very passionate about what it is trying to tell us. It is at pains to convince us. Think about things such as every higher civilization hitherto. That is a hyperbole. It is a passionate way of expressing one's thoughts. Barbarians in every terrible sense of the word. Again, hyperbole, an exaggeration. Lower down, next line, they threw themselves upon weaker, more peaceful races. This savage imagery. And finally, the vital force was flickering out of these mellow civilizations in brilliant fireworks of wit and depravity. So the language used here is actually more consistently poetic and passionate than the language of passage 2 that talks about poetry but is less poetic in itself. So therefore C, passage 3, is your correct answer. Question 30 asks us to consider passage 3 and what it is arguing about. Which concept is the most central to the topic of its discussion? Now, A, wit is nonsensical because wit does not begin to come into the argument, though wit arguably is employed here by the author to argue their case. C, nobility, is another red herring because even though the word noble is present, it is being questioned. The nature of nobility, the author seems to be unsure about, or at least is pretending to be unsure about for the sake of argument. He is saying that the more complete men, the most noble caste, are also more complete beasts. So this is not the central concept. One might be tempted to pick D, civilization, because after all, the passage does discuss civilization and brings into question the meaning of what it is to be civilized. However, once again, in the question, we have the word most. And whereas civilization is important to this argument, we can also phrase things more precisely. And if there is a more precise formulation of what the passage is about, then that should be the answer that we choose. And power, i.e., the struggle between civilizations, is really what captures it best. We're talking about barbarians throwing themselves upon weaker, more peaceful races. History is presented here as a struggle for power, and therefore B, power, is our correct answer. Question 31, once again, asks us to consider all the passages and determine which one is least concerned with the causes of history. So to determine that, we need to go through the paragraphs one by one and see how concerned they are with the causes of history. The one that emerges the least concerned will be our correct answer. Let's take a look at passage 1. The very end of the passage says, "The will of the historic hero does not control the actions of the mass, but is itself continually controlled." We can see, and by the way, going towards the very end of the passage is often a good heuristic for capturing its spirit. We can see, therefore, that the passage is analyzing, it is questioning whether it is the historic hero or the masses or something else that brings about historical events, historical change. So yes, it is concerned with the causes of history. Let us look at passage 2. Now, passage 2, while it can be taken to be less concerned about the causes of history, does not contradict a concern with history's causes. It is compatible with saying that causes are potentially of interest. Passage 3 is directly concerned with the causes of history. If we look at the first line, it is questioning how, quote, "every higher civilization hitherto has originated," unquote. So the origins of civilization, i.e., the causes of history, are its most direct concern, its topic of investigation. So that cannot possibly be the correct answer, which leaves us with D, which indeed is completely future focused. It is not concerned with the causes of history because it is almost being dismissive of these causes. It is being dismissive of the past. It is a progressivist piece which looks toward the future and believes that history, as it says, began in the 17th century and that the past 10 years added more to human knowledge than millennia before that. So It is not at all concerned with the causes of history. It believes in a bright future and is talking about that. Therefore, D is our correct answer. Question 32 is a zooming in sort of question. It's the question that asks you to take out your magnifying glass and look closely at a particular passage, and more specifically at lines 9 to 11 of passage 1. It asks whether the writer believes that his conclusion is provisional, self-evident, controversial, or revolutionary. Now, there is no evidence in lines 9 to 11, or anywhere else in the passage for that matter, that the writer believes their conclusion to be provisional. It says, we need only penetrate to the essence of any historic event to be convinced that. There is no suggestion of anything being provisional there. C, controversial. It is the opposite that the author is saying here. He's saying, if we penetrate to the essence of any historic event, we will see clearly that. So it is not controversial at all. He is saying it should be very easy to understand. The author of this passage is signaling a departure from something, which may tempt us to pick revolutionary. We need only look at line 9 and the beginning of this concluding sentence, which begins with but we need only to penetrate to the essence, and so on, which suggests that there is something that this author is arguing against. However, revolutionary is a very high valence word. Option B, self-evident, is much easier to argue for. It is essentially saying we need to do this one thing, even though it seems like a pretty complicated thing to manage, to penetrate the essence of a historic event, whatever that may be. But if we do that one thing, we will become completely convinced of what this person is saying. That is the argument here. Therefore, the author believes and clearly states their explanation to be self-evident, and B is your correct answer. Question 33 asks us to consider the passages in terms of how optimistic they are. And here, a good way of saving yourself some time is going to the final concluding sentence of each passage to gauge the overall tone and message. It works really well in this case. If we look at passage 1, the will of the historic hero does not control the actions. It is itself continually controlled. This sounds neutral rather than optimistic. It is not saying something is particularly good or bad. It is simply stating what it perceives to be a fact. Passage 2, quite passionate and expressive, but again, it is not saying anything good or bad. It is simply saying that the means of expression through poetry is something that suits history very well. More complete men is at every point also more complete beasts. Really, we cannot accuse it of excessive optimism, to say the least. Whereas passage 4 ends in the opening of a new era, and that is by far the most optimistic passage. It is a passage that expresses a strong belief in progress, in moving forward, in acquiring more knowledge, and in the ability of that knowledge to bring good to mankind. Therefore, D4 is our correct answer.